Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I am Jack Ite. On today's show, farm and other F words, creating farms and food systems for the future. Host Carrie Kim will be interviewing Sarah Mock, food, agriculture, and rural issues writer and author of 2 books on farming. Sarah Mock was raised on a farm in Wyoming and has had agriculture in her blood from an early age, but she's also quick to dispel the myths around U.S. farm and farmers. She is a freelance food, agriculture, and rural issues writer and author of 2 books, Farm and Other F Words, The Rise and Fall of the Small Family Farm, and Big Team Farms, Growing Farms Differently. She's also the host and producer of the new podcast from Ambook Research, The Only Thing That Lasts.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, today we welcome on the show award-winning writer, researcher, and podcaster Sarah Mock. She will be here to talk about the food and farm system and her provocative book, Farm and Other F Words, The Rise and Fall of the Small Family Farm. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their enduring presence, legacy, and leadership as our show comes to you from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. We encourage listeners to align and act with the native nations of Turtle Island and all the places where you may now live. May we move in solidarity with local indigenous peoples and do our best to ensure that their cultural heritage and lifeways remain for generations to come. These are going to be excerpts from Sarah's book, Farm and Other F Words. They say there's only one thing in the world worth working for, worth fighting for, and worth dying for. It's not love or money, not vengeance or virtue. It's land. To understand how the existence, value, and costs and benefits of ag land affects us all, Sarah Mock is here to join us to unravel the mystique of the American farm landscape. We love the American farmer. We trust them to be part of children's nursery rhymes, to provide the economic backbone of rural communities, and to embody ideals of the American dream. And yet, we recognize corporate farms are disrupting the oft-romanticized agrarian way of life we admire. How do we preserve farmlands and the farms we love? In her book, Farms and Other F Words, Sarah Mock dismantles our misconceptions about American farms and examines the who, what, and why of small family farms, what works, what fails, and why. Your house, your land, and your concept of ownership have everything to do with the agricultural origins of the United States. Sarah joins us now to offer an alternative perspective on American agricultural history, reveal a path to a more equitable food system, and re-examine the notion of private property for the benefit of future generations. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to James and Joyce Skeet, a Spirit Farm on Dene Lands, for introducing us. You know, I wonder, of course, we'll open from the beginning of just sharing about your own background in farming and how this led to your current work as a writer, researcher, podcaster.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up on a farm in Wyoming, a little hobby operation, and it was amazing in a lot of ways. I mean, very hard also. Spent a lot of very cold, very early mornings milking goats to take fresh goat milk to my neighbors for $1 a jar. Man, was I underselling the market. Yeah, that was the beginning. You know, I did 4-H and FFA and all the kind of conventional agricultural, I don't know, indoctrination programs, but also also very important leadership skills. And then I went off to college. I think very much thought that agriculture was kind of quaint, but that there was way more important things to do in the world. I don't know, something far away from Wyoming and pastoral life. And then I got to college and I found out that actually coming from a farm was maybe the most interesting thing about me. And got interested in how, I could bring kind of the ideas that I was learning about and exploring, and also tie in the things that I knew from growing up and the lessons I'd learned in agricultural setting. Spent a little bit of time, years, thinking I wanted to do international agricultural development. Got a very important lesson during a year abroad that however much American farmers hate when people try to tell them how to do their job, people around the world like it even less when 20-year-old white women come and tell them how to farm.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I think, one of the most impactful experiences I had during that year was I was in Burkina Faso. I was doing a research project on agricultural entrepreneurship. And I was talking to a farmer who, Burkina Faso at the time and still today, is dealing with the fact that hybrid GMO, essentially cotton varieties, were specifically designed for Burkina Faso. And basically there was a very strong collaboration between Monsanto and the Burkinabe government to encourage people to switch from growing food to growing industrial cotton.
Very kind of you.
I mean, it's a complex situation. I think people in Burkina Faso would tell you that it was a complex situation. But talking to this farmer, I asked, what if you were in my shoes, what do you think is the most important thing I could do to help the people here? And he said, go home.
It's honest.
Yeah, great advice. And basically, like, do what you can to affect American agriculture, because American agriculture is our biggest problem. It is exported to us all the time, and I have no way to affect it, but you can. So maybe go. Essentially, yeah. So I came home and I worked for a little bit. It was 2015, so we still believed that technology was like this thing that was going to save us all. So I spent a couple of years in Silicon Valley working for ag tech companies. Then during the Trump administration, went to DC to report on agriculture and rural issues for a few years. And then I took the leap to I wanted to do bigger, more investigative stories on some reporting on agriculture, and basically realized no one pays anyone to do that, despite the fact that agriculture is a $1 trillion global industry. There's not that many people with their eyes on it. So
that's on purpose, you say?
Oh, for sure. So I took the leap to being a freelancer because I realized I was the only way to kind of do some of this work. So I've been a freelancer for the last, 5 years or so, and wrote the books, do podcasts now, do kind of a whole mix of things in the ag space. So yeah, the joke that I tell is that I'm trying to have every job in agriculture so that I can decide which is the most impactful, fulfilling one.
Well, I think you play a very critical role, and this book is essential read, I think, for anyone who cares about land, farming, the state of the future of the world, because that is all tied to our foods and the land. I want to share an excerpt from your book. Again, there's going to be a lot of sprinklings of quotes from your book because it's so essential. The good farm, the ultimate underdog, is supposed to triumph. The tougher pill to swallow is that our amber waves of grain love affair with these farms is rooted in hundreds of years of white settler culture, I'm going to add colonization, irrevocably tied to a version of the American dream that encouraged white immigrants to take indigenous land, enslave people to work it, and transform it into cash by whatever means necessary. These are the two faces of America's agrarian dream, and they cannot be separated. So opening with that, I think we have to open with that, especially in honor to Indigenous peoples and all the things that they've suffered at the hands of this agricultural system, and just going back and really remembering the history here. What would you like to add to that? I mean, those are your words, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and some of the work I've done more recently with the podcast that I'm working on, The Only Thing That Lasts, about American farmland, covers a lot of ground that I didn't get to cover in the book around. I think there are lots of important conversations about what were America's founding principles? Why did people come here? What were there were spiritual reasons, there was philosophical reasons that white immigrants came from Europe. But I think that the most direct and practical one that often gets overlooked is just land. People just wanted space. I mean, part of it was because the commons in Europe were being closed. There were a lot of landless, disinherited people in the world. And the promise was they could right that wrong by coming here to a continent that they were told was empty and take what had been taken from them. So I don't know. I mean, obviously for the last 400 years, we've been like mainstream white culture has been dressing that up as like a glorious action, a glorious activity. You know, I think it's a complicated, it's like, I don't know, hurt people when you've been dispossessed. I think the idea of dispossessing other people is not beyond the pale of things that you would consider doing. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just, you know, the way that this kind of echoes through history, when we look at something like, you know, the call for 40 acres and a mule after the end of the Civil War, and the fact that Black people, recently freed slaves in the South, said, you know, we're not really free if we don't have land. That is how, like, that has been true throughout American history, where people felt, if I do not own this land, then I am not free. I am a servant. Like, I am a slave to someone else. And that has been true. That was true when the pioneers, or the Pilgrims first arrived. That was true when the pioneers moved west. That was true at the end of the Civil War. That was true at every moment throughout American history. And it has led to a long history of land insecurity and dispossession in every generation. And, you know, I think we could even look at right now, I mean, gentrification is just another flavor of dispossession. It is, I mean, it's affecting some people based on the color of their skin, have always been more vulnerable to dispossession, but also poor people, people without political power.
Regardless of the color of your skin, but the socioeconomics of it, right?
Yeah. And I think that is, you know, we think of dispossession and like the giving out of free land as a thing that happens or happened in the past and happened in a very kind of limited time. But actually, one, the literal Homestead Act was still in effect until the 1980s. Land was still being given out for free in Alaska at that time. But also, people are still being dispossessed today, and people are still getting land cheaply for free. I mean, consolidation in agriculture is still a huge problem. And it has been a huge problem for hundreds of years, that fewer and fewer people own more and more of the land, and the rest of the population is left as a servant class.
As a serf, I think. Could you talk about, could you remind listeners of the Homesteading Act of 1862? Just the basics of it, if they don't.
Yeah. So basically, President Lincoln signed an act, the idea being that, I mean, we can talk about like the deep complexities of like what was happening. I mean, I think a compelling justification for the Homestead Act was there was just too many poor landless whites, and there was also indigenous people in the western part of the United States that America's government wanted to not be there anymore. So to connect the coasts of America and to make it safe for the railroad and industry to populate the middle part of the country, they sent poor white people, a lot of actually very recent immigrants, a lot of people who didn't speak any English and who they wanted to clear out of eastern cities where they were becoming a problem. I'm going to say heavy quotes, becoming a problem, sent them out into the prairie to have free land if they could prove up, if they could basically stay, occupy, build a house, and plant a crop for 5 years, then they would get 160 acres for free. Later, it was more land when it was further west. And yeah, I mean, it was a huge, today there's probably about 90 million descendants of homesteaders, and a radical amount of wealth was transferred to almost exclusively white people during that era. But, you know, at the same time, also the Homestead Act like did not work out for a lot of people. A lot of people impoverished themselves moving west, only to find out that a lot of the West is not very well suited for agriculture, and then moved back east as laborers to live in poverty. So it was a very fraught era.
But given that, you know, how do we keep going back to the land. So much of your work has been, of course, about land, because it is really the core source of so many of our modern day ills and what's going on with the environment and ecosystem degradation. And I'm wondering, how do we go back? How do we reassess this piece of land and the way we value land and private ownership? I mean, I think that all is something that it's not easy to unravel, especially when so much of land is consolidated by these wealthy few. So I don't know what your ideas are about that. And when we have the land back movement, how do we address all of the stolen lands? I mean, it's complex.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the I don't know, $1 million question, but I think to like, I mean, when we talk about the indigenous stake in this question, like land back, absolutely. Indigenous people like should be consulted and their ideas should be heard and discussed and kind of utilized first in any discussion about, what do we do now? How do we right this injustice? And I think actually history has some interesting solutions for us to consider as well. Thinking about the moment when European settlers first arrived in North America, well, English settlers first arrived in North America, their confrontation with the local indigenous people of New England was actually like a really interesting case study in two different ways to manage land that are likely equally as effective in terms of like having like a healthy relationship to the land, right? Which is that Europeans believe that like private ownership, having a deed, having a fence, having like a clear idea of like this is mine and everything else is not, was the only way to do it, right? That's called fee simple ownership. Indigenous people then, and some indigenous groups throughout North American history up till today believe in a use-based system, right? Which is that you can have what you can use. And when you stop using it, it reverts to community ownership because in fact, all of the land really belongs to the community.
No one, I guess, is.
Yeah. Yeah. But like,
they're using it, but there's no concept of ownership is what I mean.
Exactly. And this was the commons. Europeans had a concept of what this was, use-based ownership, which was basically like, as long as you can use it and work it, you can put your labor into the ground and have the outcome and make your own decisions. And as soon as you stop using it, then it reverts to community ownership and can be redistributed to someone else who will use it, which when you think about problems like consolidation, actually a lot of the problems, things like lack of access for new and beginning farmers, this is how you solve that problem, is with use-based land access.
How do we transform it when so much of the land has already been consolidated in the hands of so few? That's like, how do you wrest that land? That's the thing. It's not they're not going to surrender that easily,
Yeah. I mean, this is where I guess like if the question is about like the practically how do you do that? Transform everything it means to be America as the country that we've been building for 400 years, I think would be the first. Because we are literally a country based on private property. Like that was the most important principle and value. It is the kind of foundation of protecting private property is the foundation of our legal system. Like, I don't know, to get to a place where we could have kind of any kind of significant land reform, to turn back the process of consolidation, to as you say, wrest land from the hands of the people, and more often like corporations that own it, would require a fundamental rethinking of what private property is and how capitalism works.
Yeah, well, also in how wealth is created. But Sarah, we're going to take a break right here. We know that this is kind of the crux of everything underlying. This is at the foundational crux of it all. But listeners will be right back with Sarah Mock and of her book, Farm and Other F Words, in just a minute.
You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a public-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and SoCal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at Patreon/EcoJusticeRadio. Today, you're listening to Farm and Other F Words, Creating Farms and Food Systems for the Future, with host Carrie Kim and guest Sarah Mock, food, agriculture, and rural issues writer and author of 2 books on farming.
So, Sarah, we've been talking about sort of the dismantling of the commons in Europe, how the Europeans arrived here, and then all the land theft that occurred here, and then also how we could possibly return to some notion, I would say return to some notion of the commons. And this is not an easy process, but would like to do a little shift to the agrarian narrative, because this is also part of that all romanticism of farming in America. And in your book, you talk about this as a deep psychic hold on all of us, and it intersects our ideas of patriotism, rugged individualism, self-sufficiency, nature, and our deep cultural connections to food. So how do we unwind how we have tied this agrarian narrative to this romantic notion of the farmer as a good and noble person, when fundamentally underneath that is all that 400 years of enslavement and land theft and oppression and genocide? I mean, it's
Yeah. A big question. One I feel like I've spent most of my career at this point working around, maybe not directly on, but around. I think the first, I mean, in my mind, the first helpful thing to do, or the first helpful step in trying to separate just our fond feelings and all our kind of narrative and cultural attachments to the idea of a farmer, is to just like remember what farming is for. Farmers don't like exist in the world just on their own as like, right? Farmers are not angels. I don't know that angels exist either, but they're not like it's not like a fundamental characteristic of a person's identity. It's a job.
Mhm,
Like, frankly, it's a way that people spend time.
mhm,
And we farm for food, to make food, to grow
mhm,
food. Fiber also perhaps, arguably fuel, feed as well. But growing food is why we farm.
mhm.
And I think when we frame it that way and then look at our agricultural landscape, it looks very different, because a
Right.
lot of people who have the title farmer do
Mhm.
not grow food.
You're not
They
farm.
do,
Mhm,
yeah. And they do not, I mean, in many cases, even do work,
mhm,
even like touch the soil or interact with animals
mhm.
or raise plants. They, do indirect farm work. They own land, and that's their connection to it. They, might drive equipment. They might market grain. They might market livestock. But the actual kind of work of agriculture is, of course, done by farm workers
Right.
who are denied the title farmer because they don't own land. And so denied also, I think, all of the fond feelings we have for farmers,
Mhm,
despite the fact that if what we love about farmers is this important work that they do, farm workers objectively like deserve the title more,
mhm.
arguably.
Well,
So,
that's
oh,
that's really the feudal. We're still in the feudal system.
yeah,
I mean, it hasn't changed. I mean,
yeah.
I don't mean across the board everywhere, but that is still very much in existence today.
Oh, totally. I mean, the thing that I yeah, like to remember, the plantation system before it came to America had already been around for hundreds of years in England and Scotland and Ireland, where it
Mhm,
was perfected. And that means that, the plantation system today has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years,
mhm,
500 plus years.
mhm.
It will take more than
Right.
50 years to unwind it. And we've
Mhm.
not been working on it for 50 years.
Sure,
50
sure.
years ago, we're still pretty deep in the plantation system right now.
Yeah. Well, and even just the acknowledgement, because you've talked about like your own, just acknowledging your own Euro-American ancestors, was anyone who is from that region of the world, it has that behind them, acknowledging, as you said, the racist atrocities committed by and on behalf of America's farmers, that was justified, that those means were justified, and just even making the admission that that occurred is a big deal, like starting from there, because a lot of people, it's just they're in a trance. They won't even go back that far to acknowledge that. It's like, oh, that's the past. Or, there's like a glossing over of all that history, unless you're indigenous. For many people, that's true. I don't say for all, but
Yeah, well, and there's like a very interesting way that I think it's easy on one hand to villainize, like, right, big plantation owners, big property owners, corporations, like the kind of the powers that be
mhm,
that, confiscated land,
right.
that massacred indigenous populations, that like systematically denied and then dispossessed freed
Mhm,
slaves in the South. It's easy to like be like, wow, that's atrocious, and like we condemn
right.
those people.
Sure.
It's harder to, I think, for people to think about, like, your individual
Mhm,
pioneer ancestors,
Yeah.
were also part of that. Like
Mhm.
they were there. They
Yeah.
were like the boots on the ground, the foot soldiers of this ideology.
Yeah.
And I think there's like, I don't know, I got to talk recently to the author of a book called The Cost of Free Land, Rebecca.
Mhm.
I'm going to space on her name right now, but great book. She's an Indigenous reporter and the great grandchild of pioneers in the Dakotas. And her book like really takes a look at this like very complex history of like the Indigenous people, the
Mhm.
pioneers, what they knew, what they didn't, what they were exposed to. And a big part of the pioneer story is that there's a lot of indoctrination happening. They really believed that this was the right thing to do, that
Sure. Yeah.
they were doing something good.
Something. Yeah. Mhm.
And I don't know. That is very hard. It's hard to look at those people who were, in her case, her ancestors escaped a pogrom. Her
Mhm.
her Jewish ancestors escaped Russia, like with the skin of their teeth, to come to
Uh-huh.
America and be pioneers in the West.
Mhm.
And it's hard to condemn that group. It's hard
Mhm.
to condemn them as
Mhm.
like, yeah, you escaped a genocide to perpetuate a genocide.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but it is like kind of that sins of the fathers propagate on the sons paradigm, it requires this undoing though, because we can't also romanticize that either. It doesn't still justify what's happened, but it is complex. I'm wondering if you could today, what our idyllic notions of a good farm are and the actual economic realities of being a good farm. Because given your depth of research, you know a lot more about who actually is owning a farm today. And for many
Yeah.
people, not what we think.
Totally. Well, I'll talk about the character Hannah, who I opened the book with. She and her family raised livestock in rural Virginia.
Mhm.
Beautiful spot. Had a little farm store in town, where they sold, organic, regenerative, pasture raised meats. And the story I tell was that one of the days I visited, I like sitting in the little store, having someone come in straight from, they were carrying like a brown paper bag from the distillery across the street, which I'd popped in before, not a bottle in there less than $100. So walked in with this bag, opens up a freezer, picks up a package of ground beef and was like, oh my gosh, $8 a pound. Like, this is highway robbery.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then kind of like stormed out. And just seeing that and seeing, at the same time, I just had a conversation with Hannah, who was like, yeah, this farm was our dream. We've been working at it for 10 years. We've done so much learning. We've done so much growing. I am in this store 40 hours a week. I spend 40 additional hours a week farming. My
Hmm.
husband also farms and has another job to support
Uh-huh.
us.
Mhm.
She also, in addition to her 80-hour farm related work week, was a photographer. And they had just had a new baby. And she was talking about how they were in a massive amount of debt.
Mhm.
They had done, everything right. They used to do big like drop-offs, and they live not far from the DC kind of DMV area. She felt like she had done everything she was supposed to do. She had built the customers, she had engaged with her community, she had done the work, she was a good farmer,
Mhm.
and they were like on the brink of financial
Oh, right.
disaster.
Mhm.
And then to have potential customers come into her shop and like dismiss
Mhm.
the expense of her, which I don't, $8, is $8 a pound for
By our
ground beef.
standards over here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And like, I don't know, probably equivalent to like a Whole Foods at the time. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, when there's Walmarts in the world and Costco's in the world where
Big
people
food,
can
huh?
get
Mhm.
crazy and expensive food,
Mhm.
it's really hard to justify the expense.
Mhm.
So, I think that is when we think about our small, diversified, family operated farm, like farm situations, farms, that is, in my experience, more often than not, what is underneath the hood is massive kind of free labor, or a massive amount of uncompensated labor plus
Mhm.
still like radical financial insecurity that
Mhm.
is impoverishing the farmers who grow food that people still think is too expensive. So
Well, people
yeah,
don't really connect the dots, believe it or not, the cheap food with who's being oppressed to make your food cheap. people don't connect the dots. They're just thinking of themselves in that moment. Like, this is my economic reality. This is what I can afford. And so I eat this food at this price, or I need to bargain shop. And so, but we have to connect those dots, and you've talked about these words small and also family as they relate to farms, but many of us don't realize that the actual data on farms you've mentioned. Could you talk more about the actual data, and really, are these farms small? Are they family? Well, maybe not. I think you can speak to that. Well,
Yeah, well, I'll start by caveating that we actually don't have very good information about farms in America. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, does a survey, a census of agriculture every 5 years, but they have wildly low response rates. And also the USDA is pretty bad at even identifying where all the farms are. So sending out surveys to all the actual farmers is very hard.
mhm,
But given the information we have, there are, a little over 1 million farms as of like the 2017 census. And that is, like some like 95% of them are, or 97% of them are family owned, and like 90% of them are considered small. And, like 95 plus percent are like low middle income, something like that, which is perhaps the most interesting part of the data that we have on farms, because actually like some like more than 50% have like less than $10,000 a year in sales, or in some cases less than $1,000 a year in sales, which goes to USDA actually estimates a lot of the farms that we have in the US,
mhm,
based on just like square like acreage of property, which is interesting. But yeah, on the small and the family question, I think there's this perception out there that like corporate agriculture is taking over the landscape, but I mean the data just doesn't prove that out. If
mhm,
by corporate, I like the definition of corporate agriculture is that a corporation owns the farm.
mhm,
There are very few corporate owned farms in America. The
mhm,
vast majority of farms that people are thinking of that are just like kind of significant scale,
mhm,
either confined animal agriculture or like corn, soybean, cotton operations are
mhm,
family owned. They're
mhm,
owned by families. Like,
mhm.
that's the definition of family ownership, is not that all the labor comes from the family or the entire family works on the farm. It's just that a family owns the
Owns
farm.
it. Yeah. So it's kind of deceiving because people think that's a romantic, like mom and pop and grandpa, and grandma. Yeah, it's not.
Exactly. I
Oh, I
mean,
mean,
Cargill, the global multinational company, also
mhm.
family owned.
Sure. Yeah. So that's the thing. That's what we actually have to look at. So there are these contradictions that, okay,
Yeah,
Cargill is, but it's a huge, multinational situation with Cargill. But I think the important thing is to segue here from the wealth creation, because even when you talk about the low income on farms, we know some of that is deliberate. Some of that is they don't need to grow food. They are not even wanting to do that because of the tax shelter. And if you could go into the tax shelter, the legacy farms as just a way of holding land as an asset for intergenerational wealth creation, and all that. Again, it's about connecting the dots and understanding the deeper picture underneath. It's not this romantic small farmer situation.
totally. Yeah.
Poor farmer, I should say, distinguish between small and poor.
Yes. So yeah, there are two like big pots of wealth in agriculture, right? Or really like two businesses happening in agriculture. There's a production business, which is like I sell food or some other kind of agricultural product every year.
Mhm,
There are very few farms that make a lot of money doing that. The big farms, like, yeah, make a few $100,000 to a few $1 million a year. A lot of that money, especially in the last few years, actually came from like government payments. But that's kind of a different conversation. The vast majority of farms make less than $350,000 a year in product. And like I said, a lot make less than 50 or less than 10 or less than 1,000, but are still considered farms.
mhm.
And that is because, as you mentioned, there's a 225-page long document that the IRS puts out every year about farms as tax shelters, giving advice on how to use a farm as a tax shelter. There's so many different
Mhm.
ways that like the idea of a farm kind of creates opportunity to avoid taxes. I mean, the land itself, right? Property taxes, anyone who pays property taxes themselves knows, can be egregious and
Mhm.
very large,
Mhm.
generally almost exclusively not for agriculture. That is not the case.
Right.
There are big exemptions in all 50 states for that give farms, an out. I had a conversation a few years ago with a friend of mine who lives in Omaha who pays like,
Mhm.
$8,000 a year in property tax for their home. And I know a farmer who owns 4,000 acres in Nebraska who pays $2,000 a year.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
My friend, their lot where they pay $8,000 an acre on, or $8,000 a year on, is not an acre, for
Mhm.
context.
Talk about, that's incentivization to use the farmland as an asset. And again, for wealth creation, for tax shelter, that's the real key with this farmland piece that I think many, many people don't understand is
Yeah.
has
Well,
been
and
happening, you know.
yeah, and I think people don't realize how valuable, right? We have this perception that farmers are land rich and cash poor, and that the land richness is like not real wealth because, right? Because the
Yeah.
trope is like farmers are only rich when they're dead. So because you can't access the money in your life without selling the land, that therefore it's like it's not real wealth in the
Mhm.
same way that like cash in the bank is real wealth. I think the problem with thinking about it that way is that the farmland has outperformed the S&P 500 40 out of the last 50 years.
Mhm.
Farmland has grown in value more over the course of American history than basically anything else.
Mhm.
That is why it's like such a safe and desirable form. It's why insurance companies have been invested in farmland since the 1800s. It's why like the railroads were very interested in acquiring big parts of the
Mhm.
kind of agricultural land in the United States. Farmland is only goes up in value. Like over very short periods of time, it might decline, but
Right.
the long trend of farmland has been it has grown a huge amount in value.
Mhm.
And there's no, I mean, we don't want to get into like the weird nitty gritty of the farmland tax system, but no capital gains unless you sell.
Mhm.
And if you transfer at time of death, you don't pay taxes
Mhm. Mhm.
on land, because it's
Right.
basically like if I bought my farmland
Mhm.
or my 100 acres for $1,000, by the
Mhm.
time that I die, it's worth $100,000. And that when my kids inherit it, they inherit something worth $100,000 that they like, there's no tax implication for that. If I give it to them as a gift before, there's a little bit of a tax implication, but as long as it's there's a estate tax exemption for agricultural land that's like $10 million or something. So it is farmland holds wealth really well because it doesn't really get taxed. It grows wealth. It has
Mhm.
grown tremendously over the course of American history, and it is one of the most convenient ways to transfer wealth across generations.
Right.
And I mean, this is how consolidation happens, right? Because once you have some, you can leverage it to get more.
Mhm.
It's really hard. It's relatively hard to lose it. There's a special bankruptcy chapter for farmers that basically helps protect the land asset during bankruptcy proceedings. Yeah, I mean, we've really I mean, this is where that agrarian narrative comes in, right? Because we've really bought in as a country to the idea that farmers are like better people than the rest of us and more deserving of exceptions. And
Mhm.
therefore, like, when a farmer says, well, my grandfather paid for the land, why should I have to pay for it again?
Right.
That like resonates. But at
Mhm.
the same time, like, that is an argument for generational wealth. And
Right.
the whole point of like, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson, the founding fathers, the like idea of not having a landed aristocracy was to prevent the passage of generational wealth. Because that is what aristocracy
That's
does.
the greatest ironies here, but we know that so much of this traces back to that intergenerational wealth that was created from that original Homesteading Act. Even if, like, as you say, many of these people were escaping oppression and so forth, but still there's uh, all the people that were dispossessed of their lands, and that it still goes back to how do people today, they've received wealth through their families, but people are not willing to give that up. They're not willing to give that up as an asset. But somewhere the cycle has to be broken, that people have to actually choose to break that cycle. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's the reality. Because otherwise you keep passing on that
100%.
wealth. I'm going to pass it on to my sons, my daughters, you want to do that for yourself and your own family. But the reality is that's affecting everyone else and perpetuating this system staying in existence. Listeners, we'll be back to talk more with Sarah Mock in a minute about her book, Farm and Other F Words. Stay with us.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org. To check out previous shows and guests, listen to extended episodes, and get connected with us on social media, today you're listening to Farm and Other F Words, Creating Farms and Food Systems for the Future, with host Carrie Kim and guest Sarah Mock, food, agriculture, and rural issues writer, and author of 2 books on farming.
So, Sarah, you have said in your book, there is a diabolical pair of ideas out there that our only hope is to give up on ag altogether, and the other that the sector's problems are already righting themselves and we have to wait out the inevitable shift. Neither is true, you say. Tell us more. How the future of the American farm system is still undecided.
Yeah, I think this is, for me, both kind of the most weirdly disheartening part of this whole conversation, but also the most hopeful and exciting, because I think the biggest thing that we lack in our conversation about our food and farm systems is imagination.
Mm.
To kind of build out that dichotomy that I wrote about, on the one hand, we have the folks who are like, who did it right? Our grandparents. We just got to go back to our grandparents' farms. And if we can just set back the time to small, diversified, families where the mom did the cooking and the dad did the farming and the kids did the playing, then everything would be great and it would work out fine. And, I think that is wrongheaded for so many reasons, not least of which that like fantastical 1930s, 1940s, 1950s American life and American farm don't exist. That is not a real capturing of what was happening during that era outside of like an upper middle class white suburban family or an upper middle class white suburban farm or rural farm, but similar kind of situation. So that idea is like, I understand the romanticism. I think the romanticism is misplaced. The other hand is like the very like techno optimists, like technology, some combination of like technology and ingenuity and like down to the wire, just like we're going to figure it out is going to be fine. And that if we can just make some changes around the margins, if we can just, use a little bit less pesticides and a little bit less bad to ag labor and make farms a little bit less big and, do a little bit more to help young farmers get on the land, then that would be a good solution. Also, doesn't seem like, I don't know, we've made a lot of marginal changes to agriculture over the last 100 years and they've arguably
not changed the system.
They've certainly not changed it. I think you could debate about the word improved.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, those are the 2 options that I hear talked about. And of course, if you're in your grandparents' farm camp, you are deriding and disowning the like techno future where the farm is going to be, run by robots and run from offices in New York City. And if you're on the techno optimist side, you're deriding that like we can't possibly go back. The future is not in the past. To me, there are so many other potential ways forward, right? Like to the earlier part of our conversation where we talked about, talking about the commons, talking about use-based land access, talking about, we own a lot of land in America, as in we, the people. The national parks, national forests, state parks, state forests, like there is publicly owned land in this country, which is a common. That is common land that we own as a people. And like we could be talking about fundamentally different ways to access, use, and manage that land. We could be talking about ownership. I mean, right, we do talk about, I had a great conversation with a land lawyer recently who pointed out that, despite the fact that the idea of land redistribution is kind of beyond the scope of what most Americans probably are willing to talk about in 2024, we talk about like change in land policy all the time. How in the last like 2 years, 48 or some states have passed laws against foreign land ownership. That's land reform. Like that's fundamentally changing the way, even if it's like kind of for a silly reason. I mean, the big fear is that like China owns too much farmland, and as if China could like come and roll up the farmland and take it away, which is not actually a huge threat. We can and have changed the way that we use and interact with land. And, activists have motivated some of that. Policy has motivated some of that. And just like community need motivates that a lot. Like more land policy than people know is formulated at a pretty low level of government. And, I think that there's hopeful signs kind of around the world. I could name a lot, but the one that comes immediately to mind is, the Scots recently passed a national right to roam rule in Scotland, which is basically alteration to fundamental property rights, which is to say that any Scotsman has the right to go anywhere in Scotland. Not to take things, not to kind of like not to disturb people in their private space, but like even if you own it and it's your private property, you cannot prevent people from passing over it. Which I think to some people probably creates like a very visceral sense of like, oh God, it's my private property. If I can't prevent people from coming on it, what's even the point? But the thing is, like, right, Scotland is for Scotch people. Like that, it is kind of wild to think that how much of America Americans aren't allowed to go in. Like Americans aren't allowed to utilize or see or like just cross, just pass through. And I think we could, and maybe are in a place where we can start having conversations about, what kind of property rights could we have and how many people could benefit from them. Again, like I think there is this kind of perspective that the way that things are right now is the best possible way they could be because it is the way they are. Like we surely wouldn't have bypassed a better idea for this one, like throughout all of history. So like this must be like a pretty good spot. But I think that overlooks the fact that there were like a lot of good reasons at the time that we made different decisions. And there's a lot of good reasons now to change our minds.
I want to talk about more about this farmland wealth. You've talked about that farming is the method. This is from your book. Farming is a method by which to keep hold of vast farmland wealth. The appearance of poverty is used to mask the reality of immense private wealth. So where do we go from here? You've talked about some different things. Today, the average American farmer is a millionaire. Totally goes against the grain of thinking that there's a small, poor farmer that I need to save and give out charity through tax dollars, through farm subsidies and the way crop insurance is handled and all these different things that actually conservation grants. You've mentioned many of these things in your book of how the ones who least need subsidies are the ones gaining and profiting off of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that story is going to surprise probably very many of your listeners.
Well, I mean, but the depth of it, I mean, when you really start thinking about on a deeper level, I don't think people are always considering, they think of the bigger corporate farms, but like you say, many of this is private family ownership. I'm sure a lot of people don't realize that cargo would qualify in the data.
Yeah. I mean, not as a farm, but as a family-owned business.
Yeah, family-owned business, right.
But yes, the depth is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, especially because I think most people, especially most people who care about farming, who care about their food, encounter farmers in the farmers market. And those are like the farmers market in a weird way is cherry picking the most marginal farmers.
Like the mom and pop kind of farmer.
Yes. Well, in some cases, and I will say in some cases, there's also like the person who's selling, I don't know, we can talk about farmers market fraud and lots of other things. But they're like, don't get me wrong, there are 100% like small family in the way that people think of that word farms in your local farmers market who are struggling to get by and who are impoverished. As the story I told about Hannah,
right?
Her family is impoverished. That is like easy to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just not most farmers, and it's not most farmers who make their living on a farm, right? According to the IRS, Hannah's family is not really farming. Like most of their income does not come from agriculture.
Yeah,
so
they're off-farm jobs, right?
Exactly, which is true for most young and beginning farmers, and also a lot of farmers in America that grow food.
Is it not lucrative, right? The actual growing of food for many is not the lucrative piece. It's that real estate piece and all that. Yeah.
So that, and to your point about the average farmer in America today is a millionaire. I mean, it's the real estate piece, right? It's the fact that every farm is both a production company that is probably trying to grow something and sell it. They're also a real estate company that's just holding on to to land, and
Right.
as it grows in value every year, their wealth grows. And that is, makes it so that the farm sector at the moment is actually very, very healthy.
Mhm.
Because everyone has a lot of wealth. Everyone who owns land has a lot of wealth. And there's basically almost no farmers left in America who rent exclusively. So like a vanishingly small number. But yeah, I mean, there is a tremendous it's the distinction, right? There's not a tremendous amount of income
Mhm.
necessarily in agriculture, because most of the income is concentrated in the like top 10, 5, and 1%
Mhm.
of producers, but there is a tremendous amount of wealth all throughout the
Mhm.
agricultural system. Anyone who owns farmland probably, or I mean, if they own it, they have a significant amount of land wealth. And that has gone up a ridiculous amount in recent years. There was a record land sale in Iowa or Missouri last year that was like $34,000 an acre.
Wow. Oh my God. But I want to shift to this question because I know we only have a short time left, but in your book, you say if farmland is both a high value investment vehicle, a lucrative tax shelter, and a desirable hobby, what chance do young agrarians have? I'm going to especially say BIPOC, people who have been dispossessed from this whole generation of land wealth throughout time here. What chance do these young agrarians have when they plan to use the land primarily for its least lucrative purpose, which is actually growing crops, like food crops for people to eat?
Yeah.
How do you see us best supporting these young agrarians? How do they break into the cycle? How do they have land to even farm? I mean, that this is happening. Many different regenerative farmers are coming up. There's not, they need like massive support because we really do need that for the security of our food system and to not keep perpetuating a system that's really not at all about farming in the least
Yeah.
and connection to food or
Yeah.
culture.
I don't know what I've talked to various times about how like the idea that people are walking around being like, man, why can't young farmers afford farmland, is like walking around saying, dang, why don't more young people have trust funds? Like, what do we do? How do we get more young people trust funds? Um,
Mhm. Because of
it's
the
a
way the system
mystery.
is set up, right? Well, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, well, they don't, because it's not possible, because you don't understand what that asset means. It's not like renting an office space to open a sandwich shop. It's fundamentally very different. And, I don't know. I think there's some great solutions out there. The Agrarian Trust comes to mind. There are people trying to find creative solutions to help get more young, motivated people onto the land. But I think fundamentally what it would take is for us to start imagining different ways to own farmland.
Mm-hmm. What could you talk about big team farming? Because I know you have a chapter in your book, you talk about that a bit, about how that is a way to have diversification and also have the possibility of other people being collaborative and collective on a farm versus it being this kind of sole proprietorship situation where this land wealth is continuing to have this legacy within families, singular families.
Yeah, there is a lot to the big team farm. And the biggest thing about even the title was just trying to create something else that people could talk about other than small family farms, and kind of the
No, that makes
dominance
sense.
of
Mhm.
the dominance of the idea of the small family farm. But yeah, I mean, it spoke to a lot of what I hear from farmers and have heard from farmers over the last 10 years of doing this work, is that it feels impossible to be a small farmer. There is too much work. There
Mhm.
are too many skill sets that you as an individual are supposed to bring to it. There's the number of people I talked to for the book who maybe aren't in farming anymore, who said like, I thought it was a personal failure. I thought like I thought, I didn't have the grit. Like I was
Right.
working 80 hours a
Right.
week,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
putting everything I
Wasn't
had
meant
ever
to. Hmm.
worked for in life on the line. And I thought that it was my fault that I like couldn't make this work. And so the idea of one of the big ideas of the big team farm is just like, hey, what if you didn't do it alone? Like, what other job are you expected? What other kind of entrepreneurial endeavor do we say, no, you have to do it by yourself, or at best with your spouse? That's the
Uh-huh.
only person you're allowed to,
Right, right, right. Sure, sure.
collaborate with.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's like, you would never start a startup like that. You probably wouldn't start a business like that, like any other kind of business.
Mhm.
And so just kind of, part of the idea is just to kind of like switch the perspective to
Mhm.
say, if this was if you thought of your farm more like a small business or more like a law firm or like a startup or all of these other kind of like entrepreneurial business models that we've created and people are very and have normalized and people are familiar with, like that would none of these other sectors would the expectations we put on small farmers exist. Where it's like
nobly toil alone kind of a thing, right?
Exactly. And do all the work yourself and also be the manager and also, the salesperson, and every role you have to do it. Maybe your wife can help.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people are signing up for that singular. I don't think so. For the labor of that. Sarah, thank you so much for all of your research, for being that voice out there, chiming about this constantly, because it's so important. And you bring so many perspectives that really need to be addressed. And we all need to keep pondering. We can't answer all these questions here. We've talked a lot about different things, and we're not going to answer those questions here, but it's so that we continue dreaming on it and pondering and seeing what is wrong with the system. How do we change what's happening? How do we contribute? How are we propping up the wrong farms? We don't even know. What are we supporting? Sometimes we think we're supporting this pastoral ideal, but it's not really the case. It's more like this private land, intergenerational, wealth creation that we are supporting. We don't know what we're supporting. So if you could share some of the links of where people can find you on your Substack. I didn't get a chance to talk about the sequel to your book as well. I guess that's in process still.
Books are Farm and Other F Words, also Big Team Farms they are both out now. Books, again, the podcast is The Only Thing That Lasts, out by Ambrook Research. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. And then my Substack is sarahmock@substack.com. The newsletter title is People Eat the Land. So all of those places. I'm not really on the social medias anymore, but you can also just reach out to me on email. My website is Sarah K. Mock. You can find my contact info there.
This is the book, listeners. Highly, highly recommend it. It is a provocative read. I think we would benefit from reading this book, given everything that's going on with farmland today and farming. We really need to create a different future for farming here. So thank you again, Sarah, for being here. We so value your time.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guest, writer Sarah Mock. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been A Farm and Other F Words, creating farms and food systems for the future. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Eco-Justice Radio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard, you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show at ecojusticeradio.org and SoCal350.org. Project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on KPFK, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer, myself, Jack Ite, co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.